Welcome to Sounds of Resistance. Russia is losing heavily in Ukraine, and the cost of these losses began to come hard to Putin. Accompanied by the revolt of the Russian people against Putin, many formations are being formed. Things are not going well for Putin, not only in Moscow but also in Ukraine. There are serious problems in Putin's army. Many Russian soldiers are leaving the front because they no longer believe in Putin's ideals. At the same time, serious unrest began to arise among the Russian soldiers. The fact that most high-ranking officers fled the area is the biggest indicator of how big the problem is, because Russian President Vladimir Putin has blamed Russian generals for all his losses since February 24th, when he entered Ukrainian territory. Many Russian generals had their epaulets ripped off and dismissed by the Russian president during the war. Many Russian generals were also killed in the war zone by the Ukrainian armed forces. It was reported that the total number of generals that Russia has lost so far is 16. However, with the recent Kharkiv and Donbas counterattacks, these numbers may increase even more. According to the UK's Ministry of Defense, 6 of Russia's top generals have likely been dismissed since the start of the war in Ukraine due to the poor performance of the Russian military during the invasion. The poor performance of the Russian armed forces during the invasion of Ukraine has been costly for Russia's military leadership, the British Ministry of Defense said in a statement. It has reportedly likely resulted in the dismissal of at least 6 Russian commanders since the start of hostilities in February 2022. In addition to the 6 Russian generals that Putin dismissed, at least 10 Russian generals died in Ukraine. A different report claims that a total of 14 Russian generals of the Ukrainian armed forces were killed. Although some of these claims are refuted, it is rare that even 2 generals are lost. The scale of these losses, too, it is at an unprecedented level since World War II. The cumulative effect on command consistency likely adds to the Russian tactical and operational difficulties. It shows that the number of Russian generals killed during the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the demoralization among the Russian forces, and the slow advance towards Ukraine began to force high-ranking officers. Britain's Ministry of Defense Intelligence Unit attributed the deaths to senior commanders going to the field to personally lead operations, to address difficulties in command and control, and declining Russian performance on the front line. The Ministry of Defense did not explain how it obtained this information, but noted that a senior commander was not present at a national military parade attended by President Vladimir Putin and his top generals. The ministry noted that General Colonel Alexander Zhuravlev, who has headed Russia's Western Military District since 2018, was missing on Russian Navy Day on July 31st. It is known that Alexander Zhuravlev performed very critical tasks on behalf of the Russian army, and it is stated that it will take about 30 years for a Russian general to grow up in this position. The British Ministry of Defense said Russian leaders also dismissed General Alexander Vladimirovich Dornikov, commander of all Russia's operations in Ukraine, and General Gennady Valeryevich Zhidko, who once oversaw Russia's Southern Forces Group. It is reported that the Russian generals are in greater uneasiness, as the Russian army has been completely shattered with the latest raids. It is understood from the published reports that some of the Russian generals were captured in the Izium region. Even if it's not fully clarified, these news will increase the difficult situation of the Russian army. Some commanders are also reportedly captured alive by Ukraine and interrogated. In addition, senior officers in the region decided to flee from the front to avoid Putin's torment. Russia's military failures may also be undermining President Vladimir Putin's reputation as a knowledgeable geopolitical strategist in his home country. Ukraine's defeat of Russian forces this weekend poses a new kind of political challenge for President Vladimir Putin. It undermines the image of competence and might he has worked to build for 2 decades. On Sunday, the Russian army continued to withdraw from positions it had occupied for months in northeastern Ukraine. State television reports described the retreat as a carefully planned regrouping operation and praised the heroism and professionalism of the Russian troops. But the optimistic message barely suppressed anger among supporters of the war over the retreat and the Kremlin's handling of it. And Putin has hardly concealed his predicament as he presided over a 6-month war against an increasingly powerful enemy, and a Russian people who seemed unprepared for the sacrifices that an escalating conflict could bring. Even if Putin hesitates to reveal his own desperation, the Russian people seem to be aware of many things. For this reason, as we mentioned at the beginning of the video, the riots that manifest themselves in most parts of Russia may get out of hand with the latest Ukrainian attacks. Power is the only source of Putin's legitimacy, Abbas Galyamov, Putin's former songwriter and now a political advisor living in Israel, said in a phone call. This is exactly the correct fix, because Putin manages to stand by the pressure he puts on his own people and staff. It has started to stand up to now, especially thanks to the harsh sanctions it imposes on those who oppose it. As Ukraine pushed to its advantage by capturing towns and regions on Sunday, Mr. Putin escalated the brutality of his campaign, giving a concession to pro-war voices on Russian television and social media. Missile attacks on infrastructure in eastern and central Ukraine have plunged parts of the country into darkness. But it was unclear how far Russia might want to go to curb Ukraine's momentum. Ramzan Kadyrov, the powerful leader of the Chechnya region in the south of Russia, who sent thousands of his troops to Ukraine, accused the Russian army of making mistakes and not making the withdrawal public. This situation also shows us that Putin has been criticized by his closest allies besides his own staff. The main problem, analysts say, is that Mr. Putin's tendency to mislead his own people has caught him. The reality of Russia's decline bores holes in the Kremlin's message that the Russian army is invincible. Ukraine is full of corruption and cowardice, and Mr. Putin is a bright geopolitical strategist. Just last Wednesday, Mr. Putin declared that Russia had lost nothing as a result of the war. This was a claim that contradicted Western estimates of tens of thousands of Russian casualties. For now, supporters of the war have mainly directed their anger at the setbacks against Moscow bureaucrats or the military leadership this weekend. But after Moscow launched a massive fireworks display on Saturday evening to mark the 875th anniversary of the city's founding, an early sign that the disappointment could damage Mr. Putin's own prestige was shared on social media by the Russian public. Some said the fun was unnecessary because of the military's plight on perhaps the most humiliating day for Russia since the invasion began on February 24th. As Muscovites celebrated the city's birthday this weekend with concerts and block parties, taxi driver Vladislav, who moved from Siberia's Krasnoyarsk region to a city near Moscow, looked with some disdain at all the celebratory flags and scenes. He said his 34-year-old cousin was killed 2 weeks ago near Donetsk in Ukraine's Donbas region after being drafted into pro-Russian forces. This crack shows us that the voices are now getting louder. People cannot accept the murder of their own children in Ukraine for the sake of Putin's ambitions. The losses of the Russian army are not limited to recruits. They also lost a significant part of their most elite soldiers in Ukraine. From open sources, about 20 FSB and FSO employees are known who died during the occupation of Ukraine. Most of these casualties are employees of the border troops affiliated with the FSB. But among the dead, there are also officers of the most secret units. According to Russian Special Services specialist Andriy Solvatov, the FSB Special Purpose Center takes an active part in hostilities on the territory of Ukraine, especially during force operations in the occupied territories, for example, in Kherson. It is known about the death of the lieutenant colonel of the Special Operations Department of the FSB, Mykola Horban. Kamchatka media reported the death of FSB Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel Serhiy Privalov. In the summer and early days of the war, deaths of high-ranking FSB Special Forces soldiers were reported inconsistently. If all these officers really died in Ukraine, then this is a very serious blow to the special forces of the FSB. For comparison, Alpha last lost more than 3 employees in 6 months, in 1995 to 1996, after heavy attacks in Budyannovsk and Pervomaisky.